And on the brown notes, as Jesus wanted more than 2,000 years ago to celebrate his own birth for some reason, given that he wouldn't have been born yet, to make arbitrary self-indulgent lists at this time of year, denoting our favourite music and movies of 2024, which happens every year on this show. And the list season, my favourite time of year, has begun with my top 20 albums of 2024 in a banner year for music, particularly across genres like alternative rock, with a lot of older school-esque acts delivering very strong records this year. And rap music had the best year for at least a decade. A lot of album-length projects, compared to recent years where I've struggled to even get one or two that were that exciting each year. Probably about 4 in the list at least, and there was plenty more beneath it. In fact, there were a lot of albums that I really liked this year that didn't make my list, unlike I think last year where I was struggling to fill 20. And following that, there will be my best and worst movies of the year in the next show next week, and the week after that will be the final news show of the year, my tracks of the year. Without further ado, my 20th album of the year, and one that I did give a little bit of criticism to not being as consistently powerful in its second half as it was its amazing first half. And that is the latest from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, called Wild God. And it's a tapering off of his grief period albums like Skeleton Tree and Ghosteen, which were masterpieces, with music that's sort of getting a little bit more universal and upbeat-ish. Still very much lyrically involved in themes of despair often, but a much more hopeful record. And I wouldn't mind betting he goes a little bit more rock next time. But from Wild God, the excellent title track. It's a title track from the latest Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds album, starting the top 20 albums of the year off with the title track Wild God. At 19, Mahamadou Souleymane, professionally known as Mdou Moctar, if I've said that right, based in Niger, is a Tuareg musician, and I think up to album number 6, Funeral for Justice, was one of the great balls out rock records of the year. And from that, Oh France, from the album Funeral for Justice at number 19. Originally a guitarist and solo artist, but now with a full-blown band for the last 2 or 3 albums, I think. That's Mdou Moctar, a very political record, but also an incredible straight rock and roll record. That's from the album Funeral for Justice and Oh France at number 19. I said a good year for rap music, an outstanding year for rap music. I didn't even get to the Kendrick album on my review list. I've decided to go on moratoriums now from the 1st of December when it comes to reviewing new movies or films, as it's just a nice break. To be honest, I think that the good tracks on the Kendrick album are outstanding, and there's probably 3 or 4 of the slower ones which are very mid. I'm thinking a 7.5 maybe on that one, but it's not in my list at all. But JPEG Mafia is, and he's one of the leading lights at the moment, alongside people like, for me, like Tyler, the Creator, whose album I missed this year, and Freddie Gibbs, and Pusha T, and Schoolboy Q this year. Lots and lots of luminaries, but he's on a roll. And at number 18, I Lay Down My Life For You was a very interesting album. He's at the most visible end of underground rap, and this time around came out with an album that was more like Death Grips. Very abrasive guitars and thrash metal tones. No quarter given music, and it was fantastic. And this is probably I hope I've got one of the ones with a lot of guitars in. Vulgar Display of Power sounds like it has, from I Lay Down My Life For You at number 18. That was indeed very representative of the thrash rock on that album. A very varied album at number 18 from JPEG Mafia, I Lay Down My Life for You. Tom Krell, aka How to Dress Well, one of the year's unsung albums, I thought was a big return to form for him. Love Remains was a massively heralded album on this show in 2010, his debut, of very warped sounds that sounded like they were produced and recorded through some form of early Casio keyboard. And the track Ready for the World was my number one track of that year. Total Loss was fantastic, but after that he went a bit R&B and a bit more ordinary, and I tuned out. But his incredibly ambitious and philosophical and wordy album that came out this year called I Am Toward You, it's one of those titles where I'm just saying toward. Very intelligent guy, very educationally very qualified. I think like masters in something or other recently as well. I thought it's a very beautifully put together album that I gave a great review to. I Am Toward You at number 17, and Gas Station against Blackened Hillside. Didn't get any love from anyone, and it should have. That was from How to Dress Well, Tom Krell's outfit of the last 15 years, and a real return to form for me with I Am Toward You. And that was Gas Station against Blackened Hillside at number 17 in my albums of the year. I'll be doing my best and worst movies next week, and finally my tracks of the year after that. I saw that Pitchfork Magazine did their tracks of the year today, and it was always going to be, I thought, a toss-up between the Charlie XCX Lord collab or the Not Like Us song by Kendrick, which did in fact win. But I did notice, given that Modern Pitchfork only cares about female solo pop and R&B acts, they followed the new template for Pitchfork Magazine. Seems to be, if they're going to do a top 10, it's going to be 9 female pop solo R&B or pop acts, or one American rapper, and that's exactly what happened in both lists. But Kendrick did win that one. It's a year of win for him, isn't it? And it's going to be very interesting when Drake gets to Australia the day that Kendrick plays the Super Bowl, in one of the most visible cases of running away in modern history. At number 16, another rap album, this time from Newark, New Jersey native but anonymous rapper Mac Homie, who I've only got into in the last few years. My interest was piqued by him putting albums on, I think, Bandcamp or something, with a sale price of $1,500. Like selling these albums as like works of art, which I thought was fantastic. Seems to be sort of circling closer to mainstream acceptance. Rich Ass Haitian was a brilliant album, and unlike the JPEG album from another fellow well-known underground rapper, it was a very listenable album. It wasn't challenging or abrasive like the Peggy one. And I can't say this word. I've tried. Let's see if I can say it. Antonio Mazia. I can't say the track name. It may contain swearing. At number 16, Rich Ass Haitian from Mac Homie. A definite woo vibe on that, and also Gonja Sufi, or whatever his name was, that has disappeared off the planet of the Earth. It was at number 16, Mac Homie and Rich Ass Haitian. At number 15, the Yorkshire band from the UK, Yard Act, debuted with The Overlord in 2022 and came back this year with a very strong album, Where's My Utopia, which was a very self-reflective, modern punk album of sorts, with some very interesting production choices and musical styles, broadening out their sound. And from that, at number 15, Grifter's Grief.
In a lifetime.
Hence, he determined.
Ain't that the truth, kid? Normally with these lists, I screw everything up so badly because I've got too much to fit into the show, and then I end up playing 10 seconds each of the top 5. I think I'm going to have the opposite problem today. as there's quite a lot shorter tracks, and I've restricted myself to a top 20. I'd say if the first 6 that we just played were pretty great albums, from here on in it would be pretty outstanding albums. At number 14, the goddess of alternative American rock music would probably have to be Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth. Since her and Thurston Moore, co-founder, divorced, Sonic Youth pretty much died. I wouldn't mind betting that they come back at some point. Especially how lucrative these reunion tours seem to be. But far from resting on her laurels into her 60s, her first album, I can't forget the name, about 3 years ago, was an outstanding avant-garde alternative record, and the equal of it was this year's The Collective. Outstanding record, abrasive, challenging, very, very interesting. I think I said at the time it was like an avant-garde hip-hop soundtrack that she'd used that I wouldn't mind someone like Danny Brown rapping over, from the sort of Atrocity Exhibition era Danny Brown. But from that, The Collective, at my 14th favourite album of the year, is I Don't Miss My Mind, Possible Sweet. You're with Julian on the Brown Note, counting down my top 20 albums of 2024 Next Week movies. And my favourite list of all in that is my worst films of the year. Something I don't get with albums, because I don't seek out to listen to terrible albums, but I do watch a lot of terrible films. Kim Gordon at number 14 from the album The Collective, and that was I Don't Miss My Mind. Few people have had, I don't think maybe anyone has had as many feature albums on the show as Keith Colzert from originally Chicago. And Chief Keef, as he's known, was one of the originators of what became known as Chicago Drill, which became arguably the most influential post-2010 rap genre, ending up in places like UK Drill, and also with this whole sort of online cloud rap sort of universe as well. Someone that was an enfant terrible of rap music around 2012, and then abandoned by his record label due to too much danger associated with him. And instead of burning out and petering off into really lackluster, feature-heavy 90-track albums with a Drake feature on them, went on to become one of the most interesting avant-garde rappers out there, with a relentless run of mixtapes and album-length projects. I think one year there was 6. I think I must have featured at least 10 albums by Chief Keef over the years. And it was definitely, I found like each project he'd veer off into a new tangent, and I found them very interesting. But there was the quantity versus quality argument to be had. And that's something that he seems to have addressed massively with his last sort of 3 or 4 releases. In the album length format, which have been incredibly solid. For Nem and the collaboration one he did, I can't remember off the top of my head, much more like he was seeking to create an album length project than indulging in whatever sort of musical alley he wanted to go down with this release. And I found the same with this album, Almighty So 2, following up from his Almighty So, his nickname at the time being Sosa, which was highly acclaimed a decade ago. And this one has got a great deal of acclaim as well as one of his best album-length projects. And also the fact that he's just completely bonkers. Like, the stuff that he's coming out with now is just insanity. And very often very, very funny as well. And he just doesn't care. He just does what he wants. And he's one of the more, I think, I saw someone say probably the most relevant thing about him. If you're a modern rapper under a certain age, he's probably your god. So from Almighty So at number 13, Chief Keef on a roll at the moment, and it will contain swearing, and this is Treat Myself. That's Chief Keef, and number 13 from Almighty So and Treat Myself. At number 12, I go to the Gumball Music Festival in the Hunter Valley. It's probably the best music festival I've been to in New South Wales in Australia for probably well over 10 years now. And it's twice a year, and it's called Gumball in April, and it's called Skyline in September, October time, which it was this year, when I broke down in the middle of nowhere in the Hunter Valley and spent my birthday on a long weekend 5 hours standing by my car waiting for a tow truck, which cost $1,000 to come back to Sydney and took 4 hours of driving to get back to Sydney. And that was how I spent my birthday. But that was on the last day of the festival. Anyway, I was very impressed this year. They got Hooray for the Riff Raff, who has got one of the most acclaimed albums of the year, to actually be one of the performers, who was very good. So Linda Segarra from New Orleans, I believe, originally. Been recording music for probably approaching 20 years. And The Past Is Still Alive was a very well-realised album-length project with some of the best lyrics of the year, fantastic songwriting and melodies, and even better lyricism. And from The Past Is Still Alive, this is Ogallala. That's Hooray for the Riff Raff at number 12 with Ogallala from The Past Is Still Alive, and one of the best albums of the year lyrically. I think the scoring I've given everything so far was around 8.5 out of 10. And we're moving up now into the 9s plus for the rest of the list. So I'm doing my albums of the year, and I'm in no rush this time, which is very unusual. Actually, the last rap album on the list, there wasn't sort of anything that pushed higher, but then it was an incredibly good year for album-length projects. And there was an awful lot of very, very strong rap albums. Although in previous years there have been ones that have made it to like the top of the list. This is, I think, the highest one is Schoolboy Q, Quincy Matthew Harley, who I featured a lot on the show. Hasn't done much of note since the incredible run of Habits and Contradictions and Oxymoron around 2012 to 2014 and that whole era, and the Blank Face LP in 2016. I didn't really get much into Crash Talk from 2019, but Blue Lips, his return was a very sort of avant-garde and well realised and varied and abstract art project as a rap album, as shown by this track from Blue Lips at number 11. And this track, Blue Slides, could contain swearing. Sounds like Sade in the background there. Well, my timing isn't too bad this show. Normally it's dreadful on these list shows as I overstuff them. And it's approaching the halfway point, and I'm approaching the halfway point. Top 10 albums of the year. And at number 10, one of my all-time favourite bands, the shoegaze legends Ride, who blazed a path in the early to mid-90s, fell apart, and then came back now 3 album-length projects ago. And I really did think that this deserved a lot more credit than it got. Interplay, their third album since their rebirth, I thought was their strongest yet. I saw them live a few months back and they were outstanding, and they had Mercury Rev as support as well. I just thought it was their most exciting of their projects. The other 2 albums that came out before it were a little bit more stately, and this one seemed to push the boat out a bit more. It was a bit more energetic, lyrically more interesting, and a bit more wide-ranging in the music that was being offered. It wasn't just all sort of post-Cure, tasteful variants on a similar theme. It seemed to really gel a lot more. And who knows what's going to happen with Ride now that bloody Oasis have got back together, because Andy Bell, who's a phenomenally talented musician and guitarist and songwriter, left Ride and joined Oasis back in around 1995-96 and was with them for many years, and is apparently going to be with them on their new tour. Playing bass in Oasis, for a musician as talented as Andy Bell is quite criminal in my eyes. So from that Interplay album, kicking off our top 10, a track called Monaco. Now, it's very post New Order, have been a lot, but post New Order from the late period New Order, I feel. Oxford's finest, I say that in full knowledge of the fact that Radiohead are from Oxford in the UK as well. That was Ride, one of my all-time favourite acts, and their rebirth has been very criminally underappreciated. And Interplay, the third album since their rebirth, and I've seen them 3 times in Sydney in the last 5 years. They keep coming over and playing at the Enmore, and it was terrific. No, really, really good. And that was from Interplay, which is their 7th studio album. I think they did 4, went away for 20 years, and then came back. And I think at their strongest, but as I said, Andy Bell could be out of the picture for a while, as he might be joining the live circus that is Oasis. At number 9, Sam Shepard. I featured on this show going back to around 2008, when his project Floating Points was releasing what at the time was sort of, I guess, UK bass music, post-dubstep music, a whole realm of artists like Zombie and Burial and Fortet, and all making completely different music, would sort of forment out of what was dubstep music in the UK before it became brutalized in America. And he was making this very sort of interesting and challenging beat-based music, and formed Eglo Records, and their compilation album is an absolute winner. And his own solo albums didn't really touch on his own music that he'd been releasing on the EPs very much. Very wide-ranging stuff such as the Reflections, which was ambient music recorded in the Mojave Desert, and the very well-received Promises album with the late Pharaoh Saunders, a jazz legend, and the London Symphony Orchestra, was one of the most acclaimed albums of that era. Also plays with a full band, very talented musician outside of sort of electronic music production. And I think another one, like How to Dress Well, is a PhD in something or other. Well, Cascade this year, I think, was my highest ranked electronic music album of the year, and his most club-focused album, but it was also a very album-length project in that it mutated through various stages very, very well. And from that album, at number 9, from Cascade, is Birth 4000. It's Floating Points at number 9 with the album Cascade. Controversial-ish choice at number 8, which is that it's all old music, but it's never been released before, and it's part of a new release series. And earlier this year, we lost Damo Suzuki, one of the most influential alternative rock vocalists of all time, from one of my favourite bands of all time, easy top 5 band, Can, from Germany, whose discography I then reviewed and put online, so you can look at my tribute to Damo Suzuki and Can, which goes on for at least half an hour from about, I don't know, April or maybe even earlier this year. So they've not been recording as a band, and most of them are now passed away, and sadly this year Damo Suzuki, but they've been releasing a run of albums that their fans, or one particular fan, had been recorded surreptitiously as bootlegs in the 70s, so far from between around 1972 and 1975. And like the band, a lot of those albums, I think there were 4 prior to this one, or maybe this was number 4, would feature them playing unintelligible music, and not unintelligible in that sense, but not referencing their albums to a great degree, or playing a song from one of their albums. That's not really how they rolled. They'd play very long, intricate tracks, which would devolve over up to half an hour, and they would snap I'm going to start this one again because I want to hear the opening. They would sort of snap into focus and fade away and snap into focus as jam sessions. But the caveat and the icing on the cake of their release series, and I think I gave this a 10 out of 10, even though it's not new music and not technically a new album, it's never been released before. And they didn't release these live albums before because the technology wasn't there to bump the sound quality up enough, which it is now. So this one, I think 4 or 5 in the Can live release series was Live in Paris, 1973. The big caveat here was twofold. One, they're actually playing songs from Tego Mago and Eggy Banyasi, their two probably finest albums, and I think maybe even one from Future Days. So 4 of the 5 tracks are actually real songs. And the other one is it's the first of the live release albums to feature any vocalist at all. And Damo Suzuki at that. So from that album, their most well-known song, Vitamin C. About halfway through the 14-minute live version of Vitamin C called Paris 73 Fünf, which I think is 5 in German, from German krautrock legends Can, and at 14 minutes on a Can live album from their new releases of, I think, 4 or 5 live albums that were bootlegs. That makes it one of the shortest tracks. The opening track on the album is 35 minutes long. And the colossus of krautrock that has proven incredibly influential over the years, and Live in Paris 1973 I gave a straight 10 to. It's the best of their live albums from that bootleg series, and released accidentally nearly in tandem with the passing of that singer Damo Suzuki. And few acts in the modern era have been more influenced by Can than Radiohead, and even more so the Radiohead offshoot The Smile, who recently released their second album of the year, a passable album called Cutouts. But the second album they released is The Smile, just Johnny Greenwood, a drummer, and Tom York. Wall of Eyes actually came out right at the start of the year and significantly improved on everything about their first album as The Smile, A Light for Attracting Attention, and was a superb album. And from that, Teleharmonic at number 7. Very well developed songs, very detailed sound stages on those songs, very cohesive, which I didn't think A Light for Attracting Attention really was. Definitely their high point of their 3 albums. At number 7, The Smile, and an early treat in January this year with Wall of Eyes, a fantastic album. And I think the remaining 6 albums in my countdown of my top 20 albums of the year were all at one point contenders for album of the year and would have been worthy winners of album of the year in a weaker year. So it really was a phenomenal year for album length projects. And at number 6, well, the reunion that we got versus the reunion that we want. I can't think of anything that would drive people into alternative rock or indie music circles wilder than Meg White and Jack White getting back together and doing a tour. I would go. I wouldn't care about anything. No one has ever been as effective a foil for a virtuoso genius like Jack White than Meg White. And the White Stripes I saw a few times live around like 2000 to 2004. And it just worked perfectly. I've seen him basically on YouTube live with his subsequent acts where he's surrounded by other virtuoso musicians, and it's just too messy. And him coming back this year with an album that began circling the news media as being sold or given away at live gigs really generated a lot of interest, because it was all the way back to sort of an early White Stripes rawness and sound. Very little in the way of the overproduction or over-instrumentation of modern era Jack White music, and it was a fantastic album called No Name. Real rock and roll, real garage, and it very much made people think back to those glory days of the early White Stripes, and from that, Bless Yourself. Jack White from the brilliant No Name at number 6 in my albums of the year, which means we're into the top 5, and all of my time increments have been on point. It's just gone 3/4 of the way through the show. So at number 5, an outstanding album. I think I gave it 9.5 out of 10. Vampire Weekend, never put a foot wrong. Vampire Weekend, their debut, Contra, Modern Vampires of the City, were all very acclaimed. Modern Vampires is still my favourite overall. Father of the Bride in 2019 saw them lose Rostam Batmanglij, who was regarded as one of the guys that brought this sort of college preppy indie rock band, a much more sort of interesting and ethnic sort of soundscape to their music, where they didn't just sound like they looked on paper. And that didn't go down very well, but they came back as a 3-piece. Only God Was Above Us earlier this year was absolutely outstanding in every direction. It was the most Vampire Weekend album. The songwriting was outstanding. The band's playing was phenomenal. And the interesting arrangements were just off the charts. It was an absolutely superb album. And from that, Mary Boone from my number 5 album of the year, Only God Was Above Us. That's at number 5, kicking off the top 5 Vampire Weekend, Only God Was Above Us, and Mary Boone. The most common picks for track of the year this year will probably be Charlie XCX and Lord. That feature with Lord on, and also her album Brat became a cultural phenomenon this year, likely to be most people's picks for album of the year. It's my 4th album of the year. I was always very dismissive of her. And I'm not sure that her previous music has even come close to being as all-encompassing as the album Brat. She was heralded as the next big thing and of future pop so long that it was almost like antique pop, but it very much came through with the album Brat. It did become a cultural phenomenon, even reaching the US elections. And it was Always Fair, and it was a masterpiece. Beautifully sleek, clubby production, often quite minimalist, and most of all, an unexpectedly main character syndrome, brilliantly self-aware and honest and open lyrics throughout the album as well about herself, her life, from every level, from aging to the point where she's scared about having children or not having children, and like her relationships with other famous people like Lord on that Girl Interrupted track. So this is the opener, which does showcase the expert production throughout the album. From my number 4, Brat, this is 360. At number 4, the all-conquering Brat from Charlie XCX, a truly magnificent pop album. And a very similar album from The Cure at number 3. One of the great comebacks of the year, probably the biggest and best comeback of the year, was The Cure returning after 16 years with a new album, Songs of the Lost World, which I took a long time to sort of get into. The opening track alone, which heralded the album I didn't even like, and is now one of my favourite tracks of the year. A morose, sometimes very horribly produced album, dealing in desperate themes of mortality and despair and lost love and aging, and it's just an absolute masterpiece and was definitely in the running for album of the year. And from that, Drone No Drone, one of the most abrasive and upright tracks on a very stately funeral album, Songs of a Lost World at number 3 from The Cure. And it's an album that I've just liked a little bit more every single time I've heard it, and now rank her amongst one of their bests, even though it's got that horrible compressed production on a lot of the tracks. Songs of a Lost World at number 3 from The Cure. So only 2 left, and I feel like if that Cure album did get an awful lot of acclaim, the second album, my second album of the year, didn't get as much as it deserved. And I was looking through the list, and virtually everyone on this list is a veteran, from the likes of Nick Cave, Kim Gordon, Schoolboy Q, everyone's got multiple releases behind them. There's very few acts. There's like, look, Yard Act, I've only done 2 albums, but there's virtually no one else in the entire list that isn't in some way a veteran. And number 2, The Return, with, like Kim Gordon, hadn't recorded what could technically be called a solo album really until recently. This was her first solo album from Portishead's Beth Gibbons, who returned with a very post-Portishead 3 album, which was incredibly well written and just as despairing as the Cure album on themes of mortality and lost love and aging. And the line that really stuck out from the album, the burden of life just won't leave me alone. Really dark stuff, incredibly intricate arrangements, and a very well-ranging album-length project. It was a masterpiece. Lives Outgrown at number 2, and this Floating on a Moment. And then the week after. At number 1, the first album since Black Country New Roads, Ants from Up There, to get a 10 out of 10 for a new release, a completely new release album, and that was my joint album of the year about 3 years ago with Rosalia. That was my only joint one so far. But the Canadian post-rock band Godspeed You Black Emperor are my favourite instrumental band of all time, and they arrived in the mid-90s at the boon era of post-rock, with F Sharp, A Sharp, Infinity, still my favourite all-time electronic music, post-rock instrumental album of all time. I'm just trying to get the track to a pivotal point so that it can end triumphantly, as all the tracks on the album are so long I couldn't actually play it. But I gave one of the best titles of the modern era. It's called No Title, as of 13 February 2024, 28,340 dead, which everyone instantly knows what it's about, and it forces you to reckon with what that number is today. And the album itself, I thought their last album was fantastic and their best since their heyday, and the album Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. Their titles are immaculate. From around, I think, 2002, 2003 or 4 maybe. They came back in around 2010, 2012 era after a long hiatus and started releasing albums, but their last 2 have been absolutely up there with the best stuff they've ever done. And I thought Godspeed, their last album, was their best since Lift Your Skinny Fist, but this actually outdid it and was even better. So my number 1 album of the year, which I gave 10 out of 10 to, is Canadian post-rock titans Godspeed You Black Emperor, and the album No Title, as of 13 Feb 2024, 28,340 dead, and we're up to over 46,000 as at the 3rd of December 2024. Adios. This is Raindrops in Cast Lead.